Testimony to the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee about the effects of human trafficking as a security and a political threat. Mr. Chairman, members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great distinct and honor to testify before you today about the effects of human trafficking as a security and a political threat, not only in the United States, but also in the global community. My testimony is based on personal observations, the empirical literature, and conversations I have heard with the families affected by human trafficking in Louisiana, Alabama, Iowa, and Pennsylvania states in the United States, and in African countries such as Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. My testimony is guided by 2 questions and 1 follow-up questions. What makes human trafficking a security, economic, and a political threat? That's number 1. Number 2, what are the risks of maintaining the international policy status quo? Number 3, following up question, how states can address corruptions related to human trafficking. Introduction. Personal violence such as kidnapping, human abuse, abusive and exploitations through forced cheap labor and sex trade make human trafficking a security threat. Human trafficking involves violent activities such as kidnapping young women, girls, children, and young men, and sales and transportations of such human beings from one country to another to work as sex workers, women and girls, and as cheap laborers, men, for financial benefits. The literature indicates that following the sales of narcotics and firearms is human trafficking as the second largest source of revenue for organized crime groups. Both sex trade, human trafficking, and forced human labor and exploitative trafficking as 2 forms of human trafficking violate human rights, restrict human freedom, and abuse of the victims. Simply stated, human trafficking is a form of modern slavery, oppressions, and exploitations of human beings. The trafficked individuals work long hours and in unsafe environments characterized by torture, rape, lack of health insurance, little wages, abuse, sexual, emotional, physical, and even death. All the revenues the trafficked victims generate remain with the organized crime groups and their networked agencies domestically and internationally. Human trafficking as a security threat. Taking advantage of the poor and their families, getting into forced and exploitative labor relations between the trafficked victims and the networked traffickers through deceptions, debt bondage, bribery, and falsified documents make human trafficking an economic threat. The physical and psychological costs to trafficked victims make this business a serious economic threat also. Physical costs include broken bones, cuts, bruises, and injuries. Psychological costs include shame, panic attacks, depression, low self-esteem, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The country's political instability, including civil wars and poor economic, higher unemployment rates, contribute significantly to increased risks for human trafficking. Both the demand and the supply of sex industry and cheap human labor continue to make human trafficking a global economic threat. Women, young girls, and children are forced to make pornography and sexy videotapes, which are sold millions of dollars globally to benefit various traffickers and corrupt political leaders. Similarly, transnational opportunities, advancement in technology and telecommunication systems, easy travel, provisions of illegal goods and services, and infiltrations of transnational organized crimes into private business and government operations all contribute to human trafficking as both human security and economic threat. Human trafficking as an economic threat. Fraud and corruption of government officials who have economic interest in the human trafficking, lack of strong civil societies, barricade against monopolistic power, states, weak institutional management, poverty in combination with a lack of political freedom due to state repressions, make human trafficking an economic threat to many families within states and globally. Assets that fraud and corruptions of government officials are very serious threats to states and are harmful to all. The traffickers target vulnerable populations, groups such as poor families, unemployed people, and displaced individuals due to ethnic or political armed violence. Human trafficking is a political threat. Empirical evidence indicates that the continuing evidence of organized criminal enterprises are maintained through use of force or violence, threats, monopoly, control, use of power, and the corruptions of public officials. The availability of opportunities for organized crime groups to commit crimes enhances their functional ability. Opportunities are facilitated by availability of attractive targets. Low level of a weak supervisions means administrations in government and private businesses, and low risk of being caught by law enforcement authorities. I would argue that all security, economic, and political factors associated with human trafficking, which I have discussed in this post, interfere and interrupt the security, economic, political, and social functioning of a given state. When the state fails to perform its mandated functions, it possesses threats to its citizens in such aspects. Risks of maintaining the status quo policy. The risks of maintaining the international policy status quo include, but are not limited to, increased threatening the security, economic and political viability of the state. Keeping a status quo implies ignoring or failing to provide security to citizens, failing to offer adequate social and physical infrastructures necessary for security, economic, and political prosperity, and failing to enforce rules and laws necessary for both human and state security. I will not turn to the questions of how can or should law enforcement authorities, NGO or IGO, combat corruption related to human trafficking. One of the roles of the state with its sovereignty and economic and law enforcement power is to enforce the laws as established by the state. I strongly believe that the state can eradicate domestic corruption by enforcing the laws. The state should make efforts to investigate corrupt officials in all levels of government operations, local, state, and federal. Corrupt officials should be brought to justice. The state should freeze and seize all the wealth they have accumulated through corruptions. That money should be used to improve the economic infrastructures in the state. It is critical that during political elections, the citizens should be alert about corrupt candidates. They can about such candidates through mass media, but also through community members. Many government officials become corrupt after obtaining office responsibility in the government or government-supported agencies. Human trafficking is difficult to resolve because, among other factors, government officials are involved in this business for economic gains. The negative consequences of their involvement in such evil business include failure to enforce laws that promote and protect the citizens' security. Another role the state should play in combating corruption as it relates to human trafficking is to investigate human trafficking networks of individuals and organized groups within the state. All traffickers in these networks should be brought to justice by prosecuting them and seizing their financial resources. The state must work collaboratively with the judiciary and other public and private institutions and organizations. The state should use anti-money laundering, anti-corruption, and counter-human trafficking laws if they exist. And if they do not exist, should be established for such purposes. The challenge for implementing anti-corruption laws is that it requires a commitment of government officials in office, especially those not involved in human trafficking businesses. It is possible for the state to manage and control corruption within its territories, but when human trafficking involves transnational organized criminal groups, the state alone cannot combat corruption associated with such human trafficking activities. Strong interstate, regional, and international alliances will be required to fight corruption as it relates to human trafficking. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, member of thank you, senators. Thank you, members of Foreign Relations Committee. Here is my report.